Shana Tova, everyone. It's one of the most common pictures you will see on social media. A 16-year-old smiling in front of the DMV, holding their license. Earlier this summer, with my daughter, we had to post a different picture of a young woman standing in front of the DMV holding a square of empty air. She had failed her driver's test. Now, the story has a happy ending. Later that summer, after several hours of driver's ed, we got to post the smiley picture. And also, fun fact, if during your driver's cone you run over a test and keep going, that is an automatic fail. If you hit another vehicle in the DMV parking lot, there is apparently still some latitude on that one. Sometimes we have to take the same tests more than once. Sometimes we have to traverse the same troubles again. Over the years, I've given sermons about some of the troubles that we face in life: addiction and anti-Semitism, COVID, the breakdown of civility in society, a hurricane hitting New Orleans the week before Rosh Hashanah. And yet, those topics are still relevant again this year. I guess one takeaway is that talking about a world problem in my sermon is not sufficient to resolve it. The other thing, though, is that I think we all realize that the same situations repeat in our lives, the same crises recur in our communities, the same trends reappear in families from same generation to generation. We have to end up taking the same tests again and again. So I took my 49th COVID test on Sunday and my 50th this morning, which is why I'm feeling so negative. So I have become a connoisseur of the brain tickler. So you know when the nurse attendant comes and gives me a gentle rub of my neurons, I can smile and say, you know, it's your professionalism that I admire. The Torah, by the way, has a few things to say about tests. In reviewing the events of Abraham's life, it describes one of them as a test. And tomorrow we'll read about the binding of Isaac, Vahi acharei hadvarim ha'ela, the Elohim nisat Abraham, that after these things, God tested Abraham. And the commentators, as they explore this passage, they ask, why would God need to test us? Doesn't God already know exactly what we're going to do? Different sages, different philosophers give us different answers. Ibn Ezra says that, in fact, God gains new information by testing us. God might know what we're going to do, but actually witnessing our doing it creates a very different level of understanding. But Ibn Ezra is not alone. He actually is relatively alone in that. Most commentators say that the tests are for the benefit of the testees. Nachmanides says that you can have the reward of doing a good deed. Breshit Rabbah and many later commentators say that is so others will observe and respect the person for having passed that test, that it lifts us up. None of those explanations, none of those rationales will explain why multiple tests would be necessary. Once God knows, God knows. Once people know, they know. Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, gives an answer that speaks most to me today. He says that testing is for our benefit, but in a very different sort of way. He says we learn and we grow from being tested. If you learn from the tests that you take, then the more tests you take, the more you learn. Our Jewish ethical text, Pirkei Avot, in chapter 5 says, by the way, that Abraham was tested not just once, but 10 times. With 10 tests, our ancestor Abraham of blessed memory was tested, and he withstood them all to show the love of Abraham, our ancestor of blessed memory. What's funny is different rabbis come up with different lists of exactly what the 10 were, but I'll give you one. It's found in Avot de Rabbi Natan, chapter 33. It's one of the earliest commentaries on Pirkei Avot. It says Abraham was tested before the Holy One 10 times, and in each he was found complete. And it goes on to list them. Lech Lecha was 2 tests. 2 tests in his 2 sons. 2 tests in his 2 wives. 1 in the war with the kings, 1 in the covenant of the torches and the parts, 1 in Ur of the Chaldees, and 1 with circumcision. Avot de Rabbi Natan explains that this is not just a random sequence of adventures, that these 10 tests are actually a sequence of carefully crafted, paired assessments, each one building on the ones that came before and raising the stakes in emotional complexity. So there were 2 in Lech Lecha. First, Abraham was told, leave your land, leave your birthplace, leave your family. But then just a few verses later, he's finally reached the promised land. He's found a place in Canaan, and famine forces him to leave. He undergoes the trauma of losing his home not just once, but twice. There are 2 in Abraham's wives. First, he loses Sarah to Pharaoh, and then he must send away Hagar. The story of Ur of the Chaldees is not found in the Torah, but it's such a commonly told tale that for years I didn't realize it wasn't in there in that portion between Noach and Lech Lecha that I guess we skipped that week in day school. The story goes when Abraham was a lad, he challenged the idolatry of his family and his community, and the Mesopotamian king Nimrod had him cast into a fiery furnace, and he emerged unscathed. And then later in the Torah, he goes to war against Mesopotamian kings to rescue his nephew. And then there is the test of covenant, Brit Milah. This test is pretty clear. Every Jewish male, starting with Abraham, would give up something in order to be marked as part of the chosen people. But the covenant was preceded by another form of cutting a deal, the covenant between the parts, where God gave Abraham a tip that he would have the heir that he desired, but his descendants would suffer many rounds of exile and oppression. And then finally, we all know the test that Abraham underwent with his 2 sons. He had to send away Ishmael shortly after Isaac was born, and then tomorrow we'll read the story that occupies our attention, our imagination, that God comes to Abraham and demands Isaac as a sacrifice. So it's not just that life is full of tests. It's that we often have to pass the same test or a similar test, not just once, but multiple times. Abraham can't just leave home one time. He's got to leave again and again. He can't just lose one son. He has to give up the other as well. Avot and Rabbi Natan tells us that Abraham passes each test, but that the answers are harder. When he goes up against the king of Ur in the fiery furnace, he is engaging in nonviolent resistance. All he has to do is challenge the king. When he goes up against the other kings, he has to hire mercenaries. He is actively going to war. When he leaves his home in Ur, he's leaving his family, but there is a promise of a greater inheritance in Canaan. When he leaves Canaan, it's harder because it seems like God might be going back on his gift. And so, in fact, even though in the covenant of the parts, God promised Abraham an heir and a heritage, it's not crazy for Abraham to think that God may be taking away what he promised, just as he told Abraham that he would be leaving the land of Canaan someday. With each passing test, Abraham is being challenged on a different spiritual level. Now, our sages in their traditional approach explain that it's not just Abraham, but it's actually baked into all of our experiences, that we will encounter the same situations, the same tests again and again. Midrash Rabbah 55 explains that everything that happened to Abraham would eventually happen to his descendants. Or the later sages say it more generally, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim. The experiences of the parents are a sign for the children. And so there are patterns that repeated over and over again in the Bible. Rivalry, infertility, exile. Our ancestors faced the same troubles and tribulations again and again. In almost every generation in Genesis, there was rivalry between older and younger siblings. Cain sees God favoring Abel's offering and murders him. And then this morning we read about Ishmael being cast out because he was taunting his younger brother. Esau threatens to kill his brother Jacob. Leah and Rachel fight over Jacob. Joseph's brothers throw him in a pit. And then there are so many of our heroes who struggled with infertility. This morning we read about Sarah finally being granted a child at 90. Imagine taking your kid to college at age 108. In our Haftorah, we read about Hannah praying for a son. Tomorrow's Haftorah tells us about Mother Rachel crying for her exiled children. And then Rebekah sought God's counsel after 20 years of childlessness. And then 3 times our matriarchs were taken captive by kings with lascivious intent. Sarah twice, and then Rebekah as well. And there are so many other stories that appear more than once, tropes that repeat in the Bible. Feuding shepherds, a romantic encounter at the well, Israelites complaining about the food. That is the one thread that ties together all of human history, by the way. Why would that be? Why would the Torah tell us the same story over and over again? We could be through with the book of Genesis that much faster. Our modern sages, modern scholars explain that this is part of a literary style. In fairy tales, the hero has to go through multiple attempts before he can finally defeat the goblin or the dragon. So having the same story appear multiple times creates dramatic tension. I think there's something else going on, though, as well. The Torah is telling us that sometimes we learn from our mistakes and we get out of the testing cycle. The rivalry between brothers in Genesis keeps going until finally Ephraim and Manasseh figure out how to share their grandfather's blessing and banish the ghosts of previous conflict. Only then can Moses and Aaron collaborate to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. Our sages, despite the experiences of our ancestors in Genesis, seem to feel that we are up to passing whatever God throws at us. Nachmanides writes that God only tests the righteous because he knows that they will succeed. But that's clearly not true. Moses has it the worst. Even for the most part, he gets along with his brother. He fails a different test. In Moses, he is told to hit the rock. In Numbers, God says to speak to the rock. But Moses decides to hit the rock anyway. Moses failed his test, and the outcome was pretty harsh for him. He did not get another one. For Moses, it was the story of Greek tragedy. If you read the Greek tragedies, Sophocles, Euripides, you make one mistake, and the next thing you know, you're ripping your eyes out or you're chained to a rock and some bird is eating your liver every day. In all of Greek tragedy, the play Eumenides is so unique because it's the only tragedy where Orestes, the hero, is actually forgiven. But we see it differently. For us, Moses is the aberration. Failing a test is not the end, it's the beginning. You keep on taking the test until you get it right. That's the essence, by the way, of tshuva. This is the season of tshuva. This is the season of repentance. Tshuva is not about wallowing in your failures. Tshuva is about recognizing and overcoming them. Maimonides says that the ultimate measure of tshuva is when you take the same test again and get a different result. Maimonides says that we face the test again and we have the chance to do different, to do better. And in fact, he says the ideal tshuva is the person who is in the exact same situation again and chooses a different answer. A person who has the potential to sin again and does not. Tshuva repentance is about taking the chance to have the same test over again and score higher. We can learn from our mistakes. Sometimes the wrong answer is a blessing. In a former life, I did neuroscience research. And I won't tell you what university I was at because people always get so annoyed when I tell them I went to Harvard. But anyway, we were looking at how the brain learns. And we were using neural networks, which is a form of artificial intelligence. And we realized that in studying the brain and in studying computer systems that try to learn the same way, that you don't learn nearly as much from your successes as you do from your failures. That if you ever always have the right answers, you never grow, you never get better. If you don't fail, you can never improve. So it's nice that God gives us do-overs because we are tested again so that we have a chance to improve. And in fact, it's necessary. If you never have the feeling of failure, if you never have the feeling of being flawed, if you never have the feeling of having made a mistake, then maybe you are in fact as perfect as your mom told you you were. Or maybe it's just the opposite. Without being aware of your failings, you never develop humility, you just stay puffed up with your own ego. And I will admit something here. Wendy and I were secretly a little happy that our daughter failed her driving test. Not just because we saved 2 months of insurance premiums while she was at camp, but because this is a kid who has aced every other test she has ever taken. And it wasn't a bad thing for her to start her driving career with a sense of how hard driving really is. Tests and trials are an opportunity for us to grow. Maybe that's why so many rabbis love the movie Groundhog Day. Bill Murray plays a self-absorbed weatherman. He's reporting on the February 2nd festivities until he is trapped in Punxsutawney by a freak blizzard. And all he wants to do is leave central Pennsylvania, which is like the Alabama of the Northeast. But he wakes up every day and it's February 2nd all over again. Now on screen, we only see him repeat the day 38 times. But somebody with more time on their hands than I calculated that he actually relived this day for 34 years. 12,395 consecutive days, which is how long it has been since coronavirus started. During that time, he never gets to enjoy a lasagna, learn to think like a gopher, or become a champion bowler. But he does learn to play piano. He learns to make ice sculpture. He learns to speak French. He saves people from deadly accidents and misfortunes. And finally, he wakes up and it is February 3rd because he has passed the test of becoming who he is supposed to be. And after all he has experienced, he realizes that he wants to stay in Punxsutawney voluntarily. At every moment, we have the chance to break the patterns that hold us back. We get to take the test again. Sometimes, though, we don't get the hint. One of my favorite stories is about two hunters who go every year to hunt moose in the backwoods of Alaska, and they hire a pilot to take them out to a remote airstrip where they go on their hunt. They come back with a beautiful specimen, and the pilot says, "We cannot take this moose back with us. It is too heavy. The plane will not be able to take off." And the hunters say, "I'm sure it will be fine. Here's another $1,000. Cram it in. We will make it happen." The pilot is suspicious, but against his better judgment, begins rolling the plane down the tarmac. "Are you sure this is going to work?" "Like, we promise. We did this last year and it was fine." So the pilot taxis the plane, gets it up in the air, and like you would expect, the carcass is just too heavy, and the pilot has managed to struggle heroically to bring the plane down in one big piece a few miles from the landing strip. And as they emerge from the crumpled, smoking wreckage, the hunters look around and say, "Gee, where are we?" The other says, "About 200 yards further than we got last year." When you look at the world, there are problems that we somehow cannot manage to beat. There's still war, anti-Semitism, worldwide plague, which, by the way, it's only a matter of time till someone blames us for. In some ways, the main difference between the 14th century and the 21st century is now we can do this on Zoom. Now, most of us have not experienced a real plague before, except maybe spilling wine at the Seder. Swine flu and H1N1 were both kind of a bust. Most of us don't really remember polio. It's been a long time since there were iron lungs or FDR wheeling around Hyde Park on the Hudson. But also, it wasn't a sudden pandemic. It was something you went through from time to time. It was a common experience. The last great pandemic was the Spanish flu of the early 1900s, before any of us here were born. And we have my grandmother Frances's diaries and letters. And you can read how my great uncles were off at war, and my great aunt Nellie, who was just a teenager, succumbed in the space of days. And there were communities that made tough choices. St. Louis canceled a war bonds parade and saved lives, and Philadelphia did not. Last year with COVID, the whole world was giving a pop quiz for which we were not prepared. Were we supposed to wipe down our groceries? Is plexiglass good or bad? What kind of masks? Hey, let's grab some pills out of the medicine cabinet and see what happens. Last year, there was a lot of luck whether we were going to pass or fail. Some of us learned how to be careful when it mattered. Doctors and scientists created vaccines using this new technology of the mRNA helix. But these nuts are still taking medicine out of the medicine cabinet and hope it works. We're now living the consequences of a lot of people failing a test the second time, even though the test is basically open book. It's one thing not to learn the lessons of 1918. It's another thing not to learn the lessons of 2020. And I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but this is not the last test. By Hanukkah, the Delta variant will be gone. But this may not be the last wave, because there's Gamma, Mu, Lambda, Sigma. Maybe they'll get together and make Ligma. Delta, Comfort Plus. One way or another, we are all going to end up with our antibodies. But there'll be other maladies, other plagues, and pandemics. Will we as a society make the investments to be able to get through those as well? Will we do what it takes to make sure that the next time this happens, that we are ready? Because we learn from our mistakes, but only the ones that aren't fatal. 16 years ago, Hurricane Katrina raged through New Orleans and almost 2,000 people died. And the impact was much broader, the breakdown of social order, billions of dollars in damages, entire communities devastated. And we from B'nai Torah took a group to help do recovery work. And so, by the way, that's where I learned everything I know about mold remediation, which is not much. And we saw the impact. We saw whole neighborhoods wiped out. So just a week ago, New Orleans went through the same thing, and they were more ready. The Army Corps of Engineers realized that a 100-year flood was actually an every 10-year event and built the levees way higher than they were authorized to, and they held. There was tremendous property damage, but the death toll was 6. Any life is too many, but New Orleans passed the test. We were so close, but then we missed the bonus question because the Northeast wasn't ready. More rain fell in Central Park than had ever been seen before. New York had the worst flooding it has ever had. People losing their homes in Queens and Long Island, throughout New Jersey. More people died from Ida in New Jersey than in New Orleans. We can prepare for weather we've seen before. We can learn the lesson. We can get better at preparing for the outcome of the weather. We can build bigger levees or prepare to just live the life aquatic. But are we thinking about how our actions actually change the climate, change the world? You know, Pharaoh and his people went through 10 plagues, and at any time they could have changed course. They could have gotten out of it with some frogs, with some flies. By the 8th plague, the Egyptians were telling Pharaoh it was time to change direction. But they chose not to until Egypt had been brought to ruin, crops destroyed, animals shattered by hail, the firstborn killed. Ultimately, though, on this Rosh Hashanah, it's not about the world's problems, it's not about the Bible, it's about how we face the tests in our own lives. Abraham faced so many tests in his life, tests of autonomy and authority, of kings and countries and covenants, trials of family and faith. The tests we face are not so different from those that Abraham faced. Some people think being married means getting just one answer right, saying yes under the chuppah, or yes, dear, after that. But anyone who has actually been married successfully understands that it's not that simple. Being married is actually a daily test. Addiction is one of the toughest tests in life. Someone who is battling addiction never gets a day off. Every time they hit a rough patch in life, the temptation is there. The circuits in the brain light up. The arm reaches for something to get through it. Every time there's a celebration, everyone else is having a ball, lighting up or throwing back a beer. Who wants to be left out of that? We're being tested in our observance, in our obedience to God every day. I love Shabbat. I love having dinner with my family. I love the crazy jokes. I love taking a nap. But sometimes it's tempting. It'd be a lot of fun to be able to go to a concert on Friday night or to get to that Saturday night party a little earlier. Happens to me every day. The thought of getting another few minutes of sleep in the morning is tantalizing. And I'd rather not have to apologize to my first appointment for being a few minutes late because I'm taking time to pray and put on my tefillin when I get to it. There are couples that struggle with the question of should they have a bris for their child. They are facing the same test that Abraham did. Will they fulfill the covenant or not? Your tests and your temptations may be different, but every day you have the opportunity to choose. There's one other place in the Torah where it says that God tested someone. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, it says that God tested the Israelites by giving them manna. And you may ask, how can manna from heaven be a test? Getting delicious bread from heaven every day, twice on Fridays. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, a 16th century commentator, explains very simply, luxury is also a test. Success is also a test. If you have everything you need, will you still respond to God with gratitude? It's easy to pray when you need something. But what about when you're living comfortably? What about when you've got the big house, the Mercedes, the fancy vacations, the kids who seem to have everything right, when everything seems to be perfect for your family? Can you still have a sense of gratitude then? Affluent success tests in their own way. My friends, we cannot avoid life's tests. And sometimes we can't avoid going through the same test more than once. It may seem like a curse, like having a bird peck out your liver every day. There are some tests that we don't want to take again, even if we passed. The stakes are too high. Abraham may have passed the test of listening to God, but it didn't turn out so well for Ishmael and Hagar, who were sent off into the wilderness, or even Isaac, for that matter, or Sarah, who dies just after the conclusion of that test. And even when the stakes are not so high, we'd still rather not. Last year, we had something like 10 AV guys here to handle our remote broadcast. And my parting words of thanks to them were, you guys were amazing. Let's never do this again. And yet, here we are. Except now we're trying to make do with like 4. And we are probably broadcasting our services forever now. Unfortunately, we don't have the choice of when we are going to have to take a test again. The same challenges are going to recur in society, in the lives of our communities, in our families, in our own hearts. Sometimes we have to take the same tests again and again until we pass, even after that. But we have a choice. My friends, we can see these tests as an opportunity. When we are faced with repeated tests, sometimes the goal is consistency. Can we prove that we're able to keep up? Sometimes the goal is growth. We can learn from the tests that we fail and engage in a process of tshuva and do better next time. We can show that we are capable of finding new answers. I wish, my friends, that I could promise you success in all of life's tests. I have some of life's answers, but clearly not all of them. So I hope that you pass often. But I hope that if you fail, when you fail, that it gives you the drive to move to further success on the next one. Because fortunately, there's a study guide that you are welcome to bring with you, and the most important tests in life are open book. Shana Tova. Wish you a good year.